Colorful text over images of past events. Logo, Illinois Cultural Accessibility Network. Professional Development Workshops. Ask about access. View shows multiple video feeds, 3 in top row and 2 below. At top left, the moderator Andy Wilson. At bottom right, an ASL interpreter signs.
My name is Andy Wilson. My pronouns are he, him. I am a early 30s white man with short, dark hair and a beard, and I'm wearing glasses. I represent ICANN at this moment. And I am also the accessibility coordinator and house manager at the Goodman Theater in Chicago. I really appreciate all of you being here and all of our panelists being here. These are 3 of my very favorite people in the world. I have worked with them numerous times and I cannot say enough good things about them. I also want to specify that this panel would not be possible without the help of the Illinois Arts Council Agency. We receive our funding through them, a very generous grant, and also the support of our parent organization, which is the CCAC, or the Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium, which, as you might be able to tell by the name, is stationed in Chicago. We do have interpreters and live captioning for this event. We will be able to put that information for you within the chat box for how to make sure that you have everyone pinned so that you can see them throughout the program, specifying how to turn on your captions through Zoom. We also have a link to a stream text page, so our captioner also has that available for you as well. But if you're having trouble with any of those accommodations, let us know in the chat, and we have some folks monitoring the chat to make sure that we're fixing that as soon as possible. If you have questions throughout this program, I ask you to put that in that, and we will read those off. If you want to put your name and where you're from along with that information in the chat, would be wonderful as well, but don't feel like you have to. Let's see. I also want to specify that this program should be a safe space for you to ask your questions. This is specifically a Q&A for a reason, and sometimes folks get nervous about asking questions or feel like they don't have the right words. And this is why we're all here today. We want to hear your questions. Also know that each of our speakers, while they have wonderful professional and personal experience, they are not the sum total of all access knowledge. So just keep in mind that everyone is an individual, and while they'll have wonderful responses to your questions, I'm sure, you should always keep asking folks about their own lived experiences. I do want to pass things over to one of our speakers, to Beth Finke, to introduce herself to you all.
Video, top row center.
Hello, everybody. My name is Beth Finke. My pronouns are she and her. I am blind, but I wasn't always blind. I could see perfectly well until I was 26 years old, when I had a very rare disease called retinopathy and spent many months in the hospital having surgeries to try to prevent my sight going completely, but those surgeries did not work. So I went from a sighted person to being blind. It was, it doesn't matter the year. At the time I was working in the administration at a major university, but my contract was terminated because it was 5 years before the ADA was passed. And before the ADA was passed, you could just fire people because they became disabled. So this past year has given me a lot of time. Well, it wasn't up until about through half of the year that I thought, wow, this COVID thing is a lot like what it was like to lose my sight, because I, little by little, not to lose, but to become, the day they said, you are blind, you're going to be blind the rest of your life, because all these things there were a lot of things I couldn't do all of a sudden. Just like when the Goodman closed, oh, I'm not going to be working with Mr. Bates from Downton Abbey because I was supposed to be the tech consultant, etc. You know how this was. Remember those first days? You get the emails day after day, such and such canceled, such and such postponed, blah, blah, blah. That's kind of how my life was early on. And I had to figure out how I could do the things I wanted to do and what things were worth trying and what things were just too frustrating that it wasn't like that. As a kid, I did not do much. I wasn't brought up in a household where we went to the art museums and went to live theater or anything like that. So early on, that wasn't something I missed. But I went to movies and couldn't follow them very well. And I tried different things to have fun, and some things worked and some didn't. I lived in Champaign, Illinois. There's your clue. Where was the university I worked for? But we moved to Chicago where there'd be more opportunities, we thought. One of the things I took on, I tried to find jobs, and I did get a job modeling nude for art students. I did that for a while. That was kind of fun. And I wrote a piece about what it was like to be blind and be a nude model. And it got picked up by alternative newspapers all through the country. And so I thought maybe I'd try writing. So I tried writing. My memoir was published by a publisher in 2003. And from there, I got recognized in Chicago as a memoir writer and someone that could be able to teach memoir. And I've been doing that ever since. I teach memoir writing classes for older adults in Chicago, all of whom are on Zoom now. And those older people are cool because they figured that out before I did. So that is where I'm at now. I started going to theater thanks to the show Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which was at Steppenwolf. I was about to ask you guys a question. Can I name the places? Yes, I'm going to name. It was at the Steppenwolf Theater. And a lot of people in the city were talking about it. And I am not shy, and I like to meet new people. And I have a drink now and then. So sometimes I'm at a bar and people were talking about this. And then I got wind through email, I think it was, that they were going to do a special tour for blind people before Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. It was on a Sunday afternoon. The tickets were $20. My average people were paying $120. And it was during a Bears and Packers football game that I had no interest in at all. So that was my first experience with a cultural event that had special accommodations for me. And I've been hooked ever since. And now I'm pretty heavily involved and do a lot of things, thanks in large part to CC, Chicago Cultural Access Consortium, and what they're doing in Chicago. Done.
Beautiful. I'm going to pass it over to our next panelist, Chuck Grumman, to introduce herself.
Video bottom left.
Hi, everybody. This is Charlotte, or Chuck Grumman. I am an accessibility consultant and advocate here in Chicago. I started my own business after graduating from Columbia College down in the South Loop. And I was lucky enough to be put into connection, similar to Beth. My first connection was at Steppenwolf, where I helped on their first relaxed and sensory friendly experience, which, as a person who was identified as a young age as possibly being on the spectrum, and as definitely being on the sensory processing disorder, as well as auditory processing issues, getting to be a part of something like a relaxed and sensory friendly performance at a theater that I really vastly respected was a really exciting opportunity for me, which in turn led to me meeting Andy, me meeting Beth, me meeting Susan, and a bunch of other people on this call. I'm so grateful for this community to have been, brought to my attention. I started my life in Singapore. I grew up in Southeast Asia, but if you can't see my video, I am blonde. I have pink hair. I'm about 5'6". And so when I tell people I'm from Asia, I get a lot of stares. Culturally, I grew up and identify as being from Singapore. So when I moved to the United States, I found a massive gap between cultural accessibility, between culture and accessibility. And as a child, when they identified me as being neurodivergent, there were access programs in place through my school, though my parents could provide access for me or any additional need I needed or any additional help I needed. So I was very caught off guard when I moved to the United States for high school, and all of the things that I needed usually to succeed, or the things that I felt that were important for me, were not available, and they were things I had to fight for. And when I realized that I had to fight for those things, I realized that there weren't enough people speaking up for others that didn't have a voice. So as a person who has had meltdowns in public because of my my issues, and it is really engaging and wonderful to be a part of community that is fighting for each other's access. I've had the opportunity to work with Steppenwolf, with Second City, with Goodman, with the Art Institute, Museum of Contemporary Art. Luckily, almost every major arts organization in Chicago that I've worked with has been so excited and so engaged and ready to make a commitment to the CCAC and to the people that are a part of it. So I'm really grateful to be here today. I'm very excited to answer any questions. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free.
Wonderful, wonderful. And then to our final speaker, I'd like to pass this over to Susan Elizabeth Rangel to introduce herself.
Video top right. Susan Elizabeth signs, while unseen interpreters vocalize.
Hello, I'm Susan Elizabeth. Yeah, it's Susan Elizabeth Rangel, not just Susan, just to let you know. And I just want to give a brief update about me. I'll give an audio description. I am female. I have black wavy hair. I have some specks of gray here and there. I have on a black blazer. And I'm of Latin descent. I have a business called Faith Interpreting, and we provide consultative and services for other agencies. We get feedback from various consumers, and we try to accommodate them with the best possible interpreting team. We try to make the best match possible with heavy focus on theatrical interpreting, which is a passion of mine. I'm an interpreter as well. I'm not only an ASL director and a business owner, I'm actually involved in theatrical interpreting. So my roles tend to shift quite a bit. So for the past year, we know that the theaters have been closed, which is really sad, but they've established a workaround. We actually interpreted a radio play, which was a different experience from being live on stage. It was quite interesting. I actually provided ASL direction for interpreters. It was a bit challenging because, the platform, just like we're working on Zoom here, there can be so many issues related to that. So that's a current project that I've been doing. I really enjoy theater. I enjoy observing, participating, and I'm always appreciative when they provide accessibility. I know there'll be questions, and I look forward to answering any questions you have about that.
Wonderful. Thank you again to all of our panelists and our interpreters and captioner for being here today. I'm just thrilled to hear from all of you. So I'm going to start it off with a couple of questions that I have prepared, and then we'll open it up to questions from our guests today. If you do have a question for any of our panelists, you can type that into the chat box and we will ask that for you. But the first question I wanted to ask all of our panelists, simple one, what's something that immediately makes you feel welcomed in an event or a space? And whoever would like to jump in first. Yes.
I'll start. I use a seeing eye dog, and I get to these events by myself most of the time. I mean, not by myself with my seeing eye dog, but I'll take a bus or something like that. So I really appreciate it if somebody from, a volunteer or somebody working with the event is standing outside, and when they see me, they say, "Are you here for the dance recital?" Or I know it sounds simple, but it's just stunning that somebody is there saying that, and you say hello, and they say, "Well, welcome. I'm glad you're here." You don't always get that kind of reaction if you have a disability and you're attending something, and it just starts the whole thing out beautifully. So just being greeted outside or have somebody there to catch me so I don't just go by inadvertently.
Beth, I love the way that you put that. As a person and as a person and as a user of accessibility services, it is so helpful to me when I arrive to a space and there are options on the website or there are options in the guide. If there is somebody at the front, a volunteer who's able to let us know what information is needed or what services they provide. It often is kind of hard for people in the disability community because it feels as if in order to receive these services that make our experience almost equalized, we need to identify ourselves. And that can put people in an uncomfortable situation because we want to have an independent experience when we leave our house and go to a theater or go to a museum or be a part of a community event. And often there are barriers that can sometimes limit people from having that access. So when I walk into a space or an organization or a group meeting, when there's somebody there or information available on the services that are being provided, it's exceedingly helpful. And as someone who uses hearing aids, heads up, I'm not wearing them today, I'm sorry. It is really incredible, like to be on a Zoom like this where there are automated captions, or when I go to an event space and they have the text available, or you can go onto an external website where somebody has recorded the voice, whether it's captions for me or for some people. I also use assistive listening devices depending on the service I'm using. For opera, it's much easier for me to listen to captions and not use assistive listening. But if, for example, if I'm in a museum, I need an ALD. So having those options available when you walk in or are planning to go, that way you don't feel the need to self-identify as soon as you arrive in that spot, because you know what is available for you at that facility. That's what's one of the things that makes me feel really welcome.
This is Susan Elizabeth. I'd like to jump in if I could. I just wanted to add, I'm in total agreement with the previous panelist. When I attend theater, it's very important to have language access, to have interpreters ready. I think that that's something really that we need to see. Because when there's a challenge with trying to write notes, with just having an interpreter available, like at Goodman Theater, they have student ushers that actually volunteer that are ASL students. And so what they do is they train them so when they come in, they're able to accommodate their guest. And it's really nice to have that language access. And also with the programs, including information pertaining to the interpreters, the interpreting team, information about the play or about whatever performance is going to be, having that available, it gives you some information before you actually engage. So those are two things, the language access, that's something that I'm really passionate about. Oh, also lighting, making sure that your lighting is deaf friendly, letting participants know like the show is gonna start, because we would miss that information now, but just flashing the lights, that's something I wanted to add it to.
I wanted to also mention the importance, I put this in the chat, but I wanted to make sure that everyone was able to hear this point, the importance of audio description and other alternative methods of access, because there are people who use tool sets that you might not identify them as needing. For me, when I'm struggling, for example, when I get overwhelmed with my sensory stuff, it's very, very hard. If a character on stage slams a door, I will not be able to hear what's being said right before and right after for a while. Having an audio describer, I don't always use the service, but I try to kind of encourage the use of it because it's also exceedingly helpful for people who might have issues with, like, for example, I have ADHD, with continuing a thought or continuing the space, making sure that you feel like you're able to follow along with the story. Access to that is exceedingly important. And I think it's also really important for people to use and encourage organizations to have that access, whether or not you feel, for example, I worked at the Museum of Contemporary Art. I had people come up to me at the desk and say, I would love some audio description of this. And I wish that I had a bigger toolkit, a bigger opportunity, more information to give to guests, and not make them feel like they had to identify themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that often comes up when providing accessibility services, that whenever you create something, it tends to have a wider reach than you anticipate, and have more of a overlap to people's experiences than you might anticipate. So what Chuck was talking about with audio description, typically we think of that as only being useful if someone is coming in and is blind or low vision, but everything that you offer is going to be valuable for its own sake, but also in a wider range that you might not have anticipated. Let's move on to another question. This is something also that I struggle with often as an accessibility provider, how to get the word out about your program. So I wanted to ask our panelists, where do you typically find out about accessible events or programs that might interest you?
Guess I'll start again. The Chicago Consortium, whatever that is, CCAC. They have a website and they have a list of everything that's going on that is accessible, and when they'll have the special captioning and all that. So I go there, and I also I sign up for the newsletters of all the organizations I'm interested in, and so I just get the same email that other people get, but at my computer talks so I can hear it. So that helps me think I'm interested in that. And then usually from there, I look at the website to see if they're offering anything about accessibility. And I really appreciate if the website has a link to accessibility, where they explain, here's what we provide. And I like there being a phone number. I know that's old fashioned, a phone number in addition to the website. Maybe there's, like, if we called Goodman, and I would be able to call Andy just to get a voice for the detail about what's going to go on for an accessible performance.
Similar, I use CCAC. It's my favorite way of receiving news. I also have signed up for a couple of different Facebook pages that are really helpful for me, but that's specifically in the audience that I work with. So for example, one of the groups that I work with specifically is young adults and adults with autism. So I am on Chicago Asperger's Society. I'm on Chicago Autism. Like, there are friend groups where people who are young adults or adults who have autism are looking to make friends or do social events or have some kind of cultural connection. So I'm on those pages, and I'm also on the pages of the parents and family members of people with autism. But a lot of my work goes beyond just being on the spectrum, although that is a lot of the focus. So I rely a lot on the CCAC, as well as organizations that I've known have shown up in the past to CCAC events. Or, for example, we did performance theater on the Lake. Susan Elizabeth was one of the interpreters there, and Beth was a part of it as well. I know a lot of people on this team were a part of this. So getting to be at that event and meeting organization representatives of organizations I didn't know were putting in the effort or had put in, there's initiative, and then there's the push after the initiative. And there are a lot of organizations who want to be involved, who didn't necessarily follow through before they saw an example of what this could be. So when I came to Theater at the Lake, I talked to so many people who had said, wow, this is much bigger than I thought. These services can be provided and helpful for others. So places like CCAC bring people together. Performances like our performance at Theater at the Lake, where we kind of did an accessibility showcase of different services that you could provide. Things like that are also exceedingly helpful to bring people together.
So social media, Facebook, Instagram, Susan Elizabeth speaking. Mm-hmm. So any social media shares that are out there, that's how I tend to find out about different events, especially if it's put in ASL, giving some sort of explanation that tends to catch your attention or my attention, and that can kind of generate interest. If it's something that I want to attend, like a particular theatrical performance, then I'll go to their website as well. And if it's easy to navigate their website, then I'm able to find out if there's going to be an interpreter provided. and the availability, any other accessibility needs. And if I don't see that, then what I'll do is I'll reach out to the theater and ask them to provide an interpreter. There's another group I forgot to mention, Deaf Illinois. They tend to send out email blasts to all deaf residents in the Illinois area and in the deaf community. So if we stay tuned there, we're able to find different events in that way as well. I'm sorry, there is one more thing I wanted to add about the website. If they post that they're going to have an interpreter, that's a way to get my attention to actually attend whatever performance they may have. And if they give a description, like a visual description, if they, have the interpreter on the stage, if they show the placement, if they're going to be center stage or off stage, that will kind of, give me an idea of whether or not that's something I will be able to enjoy that comfortably, and then I'll attend.
And may I cut it? I mean, I don't want to cut in, but may I say something here? I'm glad you brought that up, Susan Elizabeth. The Deaf Illinois, I mean, I do the same thing with blind organization, Blind Service in Chicago, Second Sense. And those newsletters, they're looking for material and they love to promote programs that are for people who are blind. So I do that. And what was the second thing you said? Oh, yes. If sometimes they're going to have an audio description or a touch tour ahead of time, those are the plays I go to. I mean, they catch my attention. I always bring an average person, as I call you people who don't have a disability. I always bring a friend who is an average person. Well, I try to find friends that have a lot of money, and they come with me. I bring them along as my partner, and they get to go to all this stuff, and they are so turned on by it. But I think that I make some money for the nonprofits by just bringing those people along to witness what all these associations, the places are doing for us.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Beth. Thank you for saying that. I love the way that you said that. I also love that there has to be a level of encouragement in each other's access services. So as a person who uses multiple services, if I see that there's an ASL interpreter or captions or audio description, if I see that an organization is providing those services, I am so quick to put that add to cart button, even if it's not something I identify as needing at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
So if people are interested in continuing and creating more access work, it's important to bring people who don't necessarily identify as being a part of this community, that they can see that the performances we're providing are just as artistically sound and are just as important. And they might realize that the reason that we do this is not necessarily for access for a specific group, but rather access as a large concept.
Yep.
And I think Susan Elizabeth had something to add. I want to make sure that we don't miss that.
Good.
Yeah, when you're talking about access to information that's happening, the deaf community tends to get information from each other or postings from Deaf Illinois. And sometimes you've got people that don't have access to online means, email and that type of thing to get this information. So it's important that you find various ways to get this information out to the community. And, you have to think about a wider range, different support groups, different agencies, and advertise as much as you can. And something that they can physically touch would help those that don't have access to the electronic means of getting information. I know it's old school, but papers, that type of information is important as well.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Some of our panelists mentioned the CCAC as being a great resource, and I know that that's Chicago specific, but ICANN is basically what CCAC is, except on a larger statewide scale. So we're hoping that the helpfulness that our panelists have found with CCAC will just be a greater, wider net with ICANN.
May I say one more? Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I'm just saying that's fabulous because, you know, I go down to,
yeah.
yes, I leave Chicago every once in a while, and it'd be fun to go to some other, yes. So thanks, Andy. I'm going to check in.
Yeah, that ICANN is a really wonderful resource. Sorry, that fell over. And I also wanted to mention for museums and for art collection, galleries, any kind of physical media representation, if you're hoping for information about guidelines, the Smithsonian Access Archives are all available online. So when I started working at the MCA, I printed every single access resource guide that they had, not necessarily saying that that is the correct way or that the way that you have to follow things. But if you are looking for it, if you're looking for a pretty reliable resource that has a lot of information, the Smithsonian archives are all available online. So if you're unable to find those and you feel the need, if you feel free to email me if you need help finding those resources. Sorry.
And all three of our panelists have generously agreed to have their emails included in an after program resource guide for all of you. So if you do want to get in touch with them and have additional questions, we will get that to you. I wanted to ask a question that was specific to providing access services, because I know a lot of you do that. So here's, I feel like, an important one. What can an event or program expect as far as compensation for you or your company's service? I know that this can be something that smaller organizations are worried about the price point of things. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Hours? I mean,
yes, our panelists.
So what can they, I don't know. I just go and pay for my tickets. And I mean, I don't know how it's funded. Is it, am I understanding the question correctly?
Yeah. So have you, I know that you and I have worked together at the
Yes.
Goodman. If you were to, and you worked at the Theater on the Lake sort of exposition of access services, if you were going to be compensated for a program like this,
to do something
that you ask for, is that something that you go out and seek as being sort of an access voice?
I see. Yeah, it's something I enjoy doing it, and so I don't usually ask for money to do it because I like being a part of it. It puts me in the scene with a lot of very creative people. I feel like I belong somewhere, and I have story. While my average friends are talking about, well, they saw whatever they saw. What was the Mr. Bates play? Andy, help me. What was it called?
That was called St. Nicholas.
St. Nicholas. And Mr. Bates, I don't watch Downton Abbey, but those of you who do, the man that plays Mr. Bates and in Downton Abbey was the one man in this show. So I went to the thing ahead of time. Anyway, just by participating and helping with the behind the scenes stuff, I got to meet him. And so I outdid anybody that I knew that went to the store. Well, because I asked him if he was in a scene where he was said, I'm not well dressed in this part. I'm kind of frumpy. And I said, well, do you have a beard? Have you grown a beard? And he said, well, and then all of a sudden he jumped. This was before the play. He jumped off the stage and came and asked me to give him his hands. And I touched his face. And all the women that were there went, ooh, the ones that could see. But anyway, that's the kind of stuff. That's my reward. I don't need money. I like the being part of it and being behind the scenes, so to speak.
Beth, you crack me up. You crack me
good.
up. Oh, sorry, Susan Elizabeth, if you wanted to speak.
Yes, so it's important to consider everything that's involved. In terms of budgeting for actors, there's budgeting for directors, set, managers, the stage, everything, the budget includes that. And it's important to consider in that budget, budgeting for interpreters as well, budgeting for access. You need high quality, sometimes in high demand interpreters to do a good job for the show. And if that's not included in the budget to begin with, that can be challenging as you go. So I love that, Beth mentioned that these things were given, free, but with interpreters, or they can be like freely given or freely like set to go. But with interpreters, you need to research their background. Do they have a background in theatrical interpreting? They need rehearsal time, et cetera, et cetera. And then also, sometimes the budget can be challenging if there is a small budget for the set. The budget for interpreters can sometimes feel like it's matching that same level. So but then again, if you are trying your best to get the highest end actors and that kind of talent for on stage, there should be the same demand for access as well. I hope I didn't say too much. I'll hand it over now.
Susan, Elizabeth, I love what you said about having the connection between the actors and if you're having high quality actors, you want to make sure that the interpreters that you're using are able to not only tell the story and say what is needed to continue to share information with the audience, but also stylistically, as someone who watches ASL interpreters, it's very clear when somebody is connected to the stage and the theatrical presence versus someone who is just interpreting so that someone can understand. There have been times when the main interpreter for that show wasn't able to be there, so they got a backup. And you can tell that there's a difference. You want to make sure that interpreters are a part of the whole process because they're part of the storytelling. It's very, very important. As a person who does not provide interpretive services, I cannot speak more on that because I don't want to, overspeak on my behalf. But for the work that I do in terms of relaxed and sensory friendly performances, a lot of the work that I do is volunteer based. However, I started my own business a couple of years ago, and I think I'll just give an example of what it looks like for me to work at the Goodman because I've been able to work with Andy so much, and I love working there. So, for example, when I am contacted at the beginning of the season or at the beginning or the previous season about a show that's coming up, what will happen is I will get information on the show date. I will get information on when the relaxed sensory friendly performance is hoping for. And I will attend the show usually 2 to 3, maybe 4 times before I have a technical meeting with lighting director, sound director, and stage manager. What we will do is we will go through bits of the play that I found that might be overwhelming for people with sensory issues, including people with autism, including people who are not on the spectrum. And we go through cue by cue on any kind of what I call shocking cues, where you might not have been able to pick up on a change that's about to happen. And we go through and we don't edit, we don't change any of the artistry, but we do bring levels down. So maybe the sound of the train needs to come down a couple volume points. Maybe the slam of the door or the horn, the trumpet. For example, in The Music Man, there was a really high whistle that we had to kind of tone down, but we didn't want to take out of it because you needed to hear the whistle to hear the next part of the story. So those hours that we spend as a team working, after that, we talk to the actors, we talk to people who are involved in the theatrical aspects so that they know kind of what to expect from the audience's behavior and their interaction with the stage. So my work usually starts 3 or 4 months before the show. That doesn't mean that I'm spending those 3-4 months working specifically on this one show. As an independent contractor, I was working full time for the museum, and unfortunately we had some health crises in our family, so I had to leave my position there. I've been working independently now as a nanny for my niece, which is wonderful, but my access work is really where I'd like to be. And so my budget is completely sliding scale. I know that people are really, really excited to provide these services, but don't necessarily have the massive budgets that they would love to have to provide those services. So my stuff is all sliding scale. It's all dependent on how much you need, how much change you're willing to make or wanting to make. But most of the time it's just me wanting to be invited and being excited about access to theater. I also work in museum spaces. So, the work is a little bit different when I'm working in a cultural event space that is around like physical presence versus performance. So it is a sliding scale dependent on that. But I have yet to turn down a job because of access to funds, because this is just something that as a person, as part of this community. I don't feel like everybody should have to pay for the work that I do, because it's our community that is benefiting from the work that we are doing as this group, as the CCAC, as ICANN, as members of organizations. So of course it's going to be different for every access service that you use, for the providers that you use. For me specifically, it's a sliding scale, and I don't say no to projects, which I might develop a boundary sometime later in my life, but I'm just so excited to be involved in this kind of stuff right now that I'm willing to work with organizations depending on what services they need.
And if I can say one more thing, I want to make it clear that the reason I don't charge, I'm somebody that goes to the place. I mean, I'm not a professional, whereas interpreters and audio describers definitely should be paid. I don't know, you'd have to contact them to see what their rates are. But I worked on the same thing. We were talking about this thing at Theater at the Lake, and we had to go to a lot of rehearsals for that. Those of us, like I represented people who are blind. And so before we put on the performance, we went to a lot of rehearsals, and every single one, the audio describers were there taking notes. The interpreters, they go to rehearsals. It's a lot of work to do, to be able to, what I see as a performance, frankly. I mean, they're part of the whole thing. So they definitely should be compensated, and compensated as well as possible.
Yeah, I think, I loved to hear all your very different answers. The reason that I wanted to ask that question is because I knew it would be so different. And I wanted to let our guests know that you have options, that you can always start somewhere. Maybe that's a guest that you can ask their advice on what their experience has been with this accessibility program that you're trying to start. Maybe it's an independent contractor like Chuck is, or someone who's doing some hourly work. Maybe it's a business like Susan Elizabeth has. You're going to find someone that you can have help you at whatever level you are at. Everything, of course, we want to be compensated, but that shouldn't stop you from beginning what you can. We have a couple of questions from some of our guests watching. I want to make sure that we answer some of those.
This is Susan Elizabeth. I wanted to add, I wasn't sure if I could just jump in real quick. I just wanted to add that some things, like you said, for example, if the ushers want to be welcoming deaf people into the theater, there are many ASL students who would love to have that opportunity, and that's a golden opportunity for them to step in, and they can offer some very simple introductory, welcome to the theater, this way to your seat, that kind of thing. In some cases, you would want the actual interpreter for anything that's going on the stage, of course, or talkbacks after. So there's reason to budget money in for that, whereas you might be able to use the ASL students for the other aspects.
Susan Elizabeth, that's a really helpful thing too, because I went to Columbia, and when I graduated, I was in a group of people who were studying ASL who were really, really interested in volunteer opportunities, but didn't have enough experience to get an interpreter role. So having the opportunity to be a volunteer to help people, and also to understand how the process works, you're then creating the next generation and continuing that community. So reaching out to organizations as well as universities, like Columbia has people who are studying ASL, and there are also people who want to learn how to be an audio describer. So making sure, if you don't have the budget, if you're reaching out to people who are excited and engaged, most people a part of the access world are excited and engaged to be a part of these projects. But I think, Susan Elizabeth, that's a wonderful point that you brought up. Make sure that we're engaging people who want to be a part of it, especially in volunteer roles.
Yes. I think creativity really helps with accessibility.
Yes.
So this was a question, some feedback on something that Beth had said, but I do think the question is something that all three of our panelists could speak to. So the question begins, the simple but not so simple action that Beth employed to engage partners, the folks that she brings to the shows with her, is an effective way to bring in change, and I want to acknowledge that. what type of feedback are you asked as a guest who goes to these after the event? Are you asked for
Oh.
feedback? Are you surveyed? Do you offer to give feedback about your experiences with an accessibility feature that you may have experienced?
I'll start. I don't recall ever being asked specifically. Oh, maybe sometimes I did what Chuck was saying about sometimes there are volunteers who are learning. They'll ask me how I did, but the professionals don't usually ask. I will say, um, I have been known to leave plays during intermission and not return. And it's hard to do that when you have an obvious disability or an eye-catching service dog, when you leave and then you don't show up and you're not back in your seat. So when I do that, often the person that's in charge of the audio description or whatever, they'll contact me later and said, you didn't like the play, or was I doing something wrong? And so I feel bad about that, but I don't recall ever being asked by the audio, did I do a good job? I think often I tell them, I mean, they did, I thank them after the play, but no requirement that I can remember. And maybe Susan Elizabeth or Chuck, you might, I don't know.
I often get asked for feedback, or I don't often get asked for feedback, but it would be nice if I did. Sometimes I do experience things where it might have been a nice idea to have access, but then what actually happened was not necessarily up to par. So they may have had an interpreter, but they might not have been placed in a great spot. So it did not match what was going on stage with the actors, or maybe that interpreter that they got was not as knowledgeable or experienced in interpreting music. And so it was more of a to check the box for access. You wouldn't put an interpreter who spends most of their time interpreting a math class in elementary school into this high-level musical production and expect them to be able to do a great job, especially if they haven't had a rehearsal time or an opportunity to work with an ASL director. And I'm not trying to slight interpreters here. It's just that these things need to be considered and made adjustments for depending on what's going on. So, and then considered also where the best position is for that interpreter. So I wish that I was asked to give feedback often, but I'm not often asked for that. And I see these kinds of situations over and over again. And so, I could offer something, or sometimes I do offer feedback and I feel like, it didn't really land, or it's maybe I was just being placated or lip service. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how else might be a better way, if I could send an email or just give them feedback. But
Susan Elizabeth, I find myself in the same situation a lot of the time. Most of the feedback that I'm asked to give is during the process. We're not often asked to give feedback after the process, which I feel is maybe an opportunity to grow, is to reach back out to your access providers after the services have been provided. For me, the service feedback that I give is before the show happens. So those changes happen. And then once the show is over, usually it's, oh, great job, goodbye. And that's not how it is for everybody. Trust me, Andy and I have a big debrief usually on goodness shows, but there are often times when I'm asked for feedback and then it feels as if they're asking for feedback to check a box, the way that you said, Susan Elizabeth. It feels like I am, although I don't represent the entire community, and I know I don't represent the entire community, I am often used as, I don't want to say a pawn. I don't think that's the right way to say it, but I'm often used as a way to check off an access box if people aren't willing to make changes or have feedback or have that conversation. It does sometimes feel challenging as an access provider because I want it to be a holistic and engaging experience and not just checking off of a box. There have been times when I've worked with organizations who have, invited me in and I'm very excited to be there. And then I'll notice there are changes that need to happen in access in other parts of their sphere that doesn't necessarily correlate to exactly the work that I'm doing, but as an access person or as a person who wants to provide access, I notice these differences. I find that a lot of places have trouble with their terms of accessibility, and they base it all dependent on physical access and wheelchair spacing. If you limit your access to just physical accessibility for your seating, it limits a lot of people's experience in your space. And if you're not committing to giving a larger scale access, I mean, physical access is exceedingly important. I do not, please do not think that I am dissing physical access, because it's a ground rule. You should be able to enter and exit a facility and enjoy your experience there. But if people just take it for granted that having the service, whether or not you've put in the work, it's not the same. Not just having someone who can interpret for someone is not the same as having somebody as part of the team whose job is to make sure that the audience is able to connect. That's a really kind of hard thing as a provider, because all of us just want to do our best job and commit and give, everybody equal access. And that's kind of hard when we're working with organizations that haven't had the background or the experience in this before. So I would say if you're an organization that wants to have interpreters, wants to have access providers, it's important to ask for feedback the entire process, not just the beginning and not just the end. Because if you want people to be involved, or if you want them to be a part of the team, it's really, really important to have those discussions, even if they're awkward, even if they're hard, even if you're not sure how to have them. Make sure that you're asking your audience what they need from you. And if you are able to give them that, amazing. If you're not, maybe put it on your list for the next couple of years. It's just important to be having these discussions. It's equally as important to be having these discussions as to implement those changes, because if we don't have those discussions and we implement changes based on someone else's opinion or what another organization has done, and not actually review what you need and what is going to be most successful, you're not going to set it up for success in the future. And the access programs that you're going to set up in the future are going to not be as equalizing or not be as engaging for people, because it was made for a specific group and that group wasn't included in the decision making.
If I could say one more thing, and Andy, you could speak to this. I think as I was listening to the two of you, it's really fun to listen to you, Susan Elizabeth, and to you, Chuck, to hear your interpretations of these. I think once you start, you get in a groove, and so for some of you out there in ICANN, maybe you're in small towns or something, so the same people with disabilities might be coming to a lot of your programs. You start to befriend them. I can only speak for the blind community. Part of what a lot of theaters and other organizations provide for us is we come early before the show starts, and we meet the people involved, whether it be the artist at the Museum of Contemporary Art. I went to some of those speeches, and theater, and you befriend the people that are working there. And so when I thought about it, I thought, oh yeah, I've given my review afterwards, but it was casual. We'd meet afterwards, have a cup of coffee or what, and just talk. And it sounds like that's happened with Chuck and Andy. And Andy, can you speak to that? I mean, don't you get to know the people that come to a lot of the accessibility?
Wait, before Andy speaks, I just want to mention to everybody on the call, if you haven't had the opportunity to work with Andy Wilson, you are missing out. I rarely speak on other people's behalf, and I want to make sure Andy has the opportunity. I just cannot say thank you enough to Andy for helping guide this organization and helping guide the people that work with Goodman and other community organizations, because you have been a wonderful resource, but you also taught us how to have hard conversations. And you've never done anything other than be kind and wonderful and welcoming to the audience that you're providing for. So just on your behalf, on my behalf, I want to thank you for the hard work that you do. And yes, you do. Andy is the person that asks for feedback the whole way through.
And Andy, is this the part where I should tell Chuck not to talk so much?
And this is the part. Susan Elizabeth. I would love to add. I completely agree wholeheartedly. Andy is wonderful to work with. It's nice to have a connection to the access that we have at Goodman. Goodman makes the whole process so smooth, so easy. And it's nice to know that you have that kind of understanding on the team. If I can back up a little bit to the previous comments about being asked for feedback during the process, and being part of the team, we do have a deaf director who is appointed, and then that director can welcome the audience and give the deaf audience kind of a lowdown on the signs, the specialized signs that we might use for a show, give some synopsis, and then also ask for some feedback from the deaf audience themselves. So to see what worked and what didn't. And we can get that information. When I'm able to get that information, then I am able to work with that to adjust it for the next iteration of a show or the next time, and wear different hats and be able to coordinate, choreograph which interpreters should be assigned to which show and that kind of thing. But if we had no director, no trust in that relationship of making this access happen, it would be a lot. It would be a completely different experience. And to have Andy kind of at the helm, making all of those wheels turn, I just really, hats off to you. I really appreciate every experience that I have had working with you. And so I just want to reiterate everything, all the accolades that everyone is mentioning here. I really appreciate that Andy trusts my feedback as the ASL director. And if I do make a suggestion, I can trust that, he'll really take that to heart and make adjustments based on that feedback. And it is just, this experience has just been absolutely wonderful. And I can't thank you enough.
That's incredibly kind. I appreciate it. I will say, I think one of the things that has made the relationship that I have with you three special is that Goodman decided to make it someone's job to be an accessibility consultant. And I think any organization that can do that, even if you can't appoint someone specifically for that role, if it can live in one person's wheelhouse rather than across an entire organization, so that you have someone who can be the face or the person who's on the phone or the person that you email. I think a great deal happens when you can create personal relationships between your organization and the community that you want to welcome. So I think that this kindness that you've shown me is an example of something that works in an organization to make someone the point person for it. Again, very kind of you. We do have some more questions I want to make sure we get to. This one, I think a couple of you will have good answers for. The question is, what would you recommend for an art museum to become more accessible?
Yeah.
Or your experiences with accessibility at art museums?
I guess I'll start again. That's tough when you're dealing with people who have who are low vision or whatever. The reason when I introduced myself, I said I could see until I was 25. Some people who are blind have never been able to see. And then there are those of us who are able to see and can't see now. So how you describe certain things changes, because how do you describe a color, et cetera, et cetera. So I've had some people try. I haven't had a huge successful experience in an art museum. Not that anybody did anything wrong. It just is, it's difficult. It's called visual art. I will say I did go to the pop art exhibit at the Museum of Contemporary Art, and I got to lay down in a couch that was shaped like the Andy Warhol lips, the red lip, it's kind of looked like Mick Jagger. And so it was fun to do that. There's a lot more I could touch in that particular exhibit, and that was a plus. But I'm afraid I don't try it very much because it's been disappointing. I will go on an art tour with average, I don't set it up ahead of time, just because then you hear somebody saying this is the blah, 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 and I hear what the other people on the tour are saying, and I get an idea about what's attractive about the art. But otherwise, I don't do much of that.
I am so excited about this question. I cannot tell you. As somebody who's worked in museums and worked in galleries and is an artist, it is very, very interesting. My mother is developing glaucoma, is having trouble with her sight, and my dad has lost hearing in one of his ears. So services that we use are not usual. My parents don't like to use the services necessarily because they don't want to be able to take that away from someone else, which is something that we need to have a larger conversation about. Is you are not taking the service away by using the service. If anything, you're actually encouraging the use and availability of those services when you come into a museum or an art space. Beth, the example that you gave, I think is really interesting because I worked specifically when I was studying cultural heritage management in Rome. I was working on creating a 3D model of the Domus Aurea, which is an underground tunnel system that was covered. And so they allow people to go on tours, but people who are visually impaired are not allowed because they are worried about the dangers to the physical access. So I was really excited and very engaged about this project. And then I found that I was creating a project for people who weren't allowed to even enter into this space. And so this project sparked a bunch of other stuff for me. As a person with sensory processing, I have a really hard time with spatial awareness. So the first time that I got to go to a show that was audio described, Beth, you were actually there. You explained something to me that clicked in my brain, which was when you're explaining to someone who's blind, low vision, or visually impaired, you want to use references that they might know. So instead of saying a foot, you use a shoebox.
Yes.
It's bigger.
Yes.
The phrase you used for me was it's bigger than a toaster.
Yeah.
And that clicked in my brain so much. And I started creating visual aspects of theatrical spaces. So for example, the Second City gave me access to their it's a type of file, and I created a 3D print, a model of that area so that people could have a tactile way of explaining and understanding that space. And that wasn't just for blind and low vision patrons, that was helpful for people who have spatial awareness issues. You could say, here's the stage, this is where you'll be sitting, this is the backstage. And the same thing can be said for museums. Museums are so hard to navigate these days, especially the ones that are modern architecture. Physically hard to access, but it's also hard for people who are blind, low vision, deaf, hard of hearing, anybody that requires a special access. So having people at the museum, just the way that Andy said, having somebody to be that point person, there are ways to make museums more accessible, to make galleries more accessible. There are cheap ways to do it too. A lot of people don't want to take on those kind of massive changes because they're worried that it'll affect their budget or that, they won't do it correctly. But if you don't do something because you're worried about not doing it correctly and you're not engaging the audience that you want to provide the service for, I wouldn't say you're giving it your all. So trying to communicate with the audience you're trying to reach, so especially in museums, if you're working specifically towards making access to people who are visually impaired, blind or low vision, or people who are deaf, hard of hearing, making sure that they're included in that. Visual tools are super helpful, as well as for example, it's simple. If you don't have a 3D printer, which a lot of places wouldn't have, it's as simple as gluing a piece of string to the outline of something on your map. Creating a tactile response, creating something for someone to touch, to engage with, and to give them a tool of independence. Those are all ways of creating access and a low budget. But sorry, I got off topic. I'll let Susan.
No, thank you, Chuck. Yes.
It's really interesting to hear. So for deaf access, clearly captions are usually what's provided. We don't often see interpreters brought in, but it is the same idea. Sometimes if there's a certain date that is chosen by the museum to have an interpreter there for a live tour, that's really nice. And you will see quite a few deaf patrons participate in those kinds of guided tours with interpreters provided. If there's a mix of deaf and non-deaf, to provide an interpreter for the tour, for the deaf people who are on the tour, can work, but it's nice to have specific dates planned out on a calendar. But what do you do if a deaf person just shows up? Can you, whip an interpreter right out of the blue and send them on their way? Absolutely not. So in those instances, it's nice to have maybe an iPad. Sometimes you can have these iPads that have interpreters already programmed in to explain certain pieces of art along the way. I've experienced that before, where I can just carry that iPad in the museum with me throughout the museum and reference pieces of art through a recorded interpreter on the iPad. So those are some ideas I can at least get the concept through what the interpreter on this recording has to say, and that gives some access for deaf patrons.
It's Susan Elizabeth. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, also, okay. If I'm just thinking, if there's a program that's describing the history of 3 specific artists, in those instances, it is important to have captions ready to go. Sometimes I've arrived and the captions weren't open captions; they weren't on the screen, and so then I was given a printout, or later I was given an iPad, so then I knew where to look. But it's nice to have the captions be open captions so that I don't have to think about where to find my access.
Yeah, I wanted to say, Susan Elizabeth, I really love the point that you brought up about if a deaf person arrives to the museum without telling the museum, how are they going to engage? And that should be something that is thought of at the very beginning, is if somebody comes to our museum, how do we give them access without creating, one, an awkward experience for them to ask for independence, or 2, not being able to provide them with those services. So a lot of these discussions will start with, how can we apply these services to somebody that arrives without telling us? And again, it's so important to create an opportunity for people to have an independent experience, but it is also important to have somebody there who knows what they're talking about. So for a museum to have a visitor experience member whose job was to be able to provide, for example, in museums that I've worked in before, they had glasses for people who are colorblind, or if we had, if there was an audio part of an exhibit and somebody identified as being deaf or hard of hearing, we could give a printout. But that wasn't consistent. And it wasn't consistent over differences in museums, but even within the galleries, within spaces that I worked. So creating consistent access, making sure that if you have an audio or a video, you're having the opposite of those. So you're having an audio description, or you're having captions, or you're having an interpreter. It really does make a huge difference if you're trying at the beginning to make it possible for somebody to come in that's part of the community and to engage and experience that. I think the misconception is that people who have disabilities or are part of our community will need assistance to get to that place, or there will be a barrier that will stop them from arriving. I had a really awkward and uncomfortable conversation with someone who didn't agree with the access that I wanted. And I said, if I was a patron coming to ask for this, how would you respond? They're like, well, you wouldn't. We don't get blind people here. And I was like completely taken aback, because everybody deserves access to art. Art is a community builder. It's something that brings us together. And to have someone who was employed by an artistic community or an organization to say, well, we don't have to work on that because we haven't had blind people here before. One, where's the data to prove that? You cannot look at someone and assess their disability or the way that they interpret the world. 2, is there a barrier that you've created that makes people not want to come? Are they uncomfortable asking for help? And 3, have you shown that community that you are willing to make changes for them? It's all a much larger thing than we really. I think when you start to have this conversation, accessibility is a lot larger and a lot more encompassing, and it's so much easier to do when you involve the people that are a part of the access. That's it.
Yeah. I think there can be a lot of fear around.
I'm sorry, this is Susan Elizabeth. I wanted to add, can I? Okay. So speaking of that idea of, we have never had blind patrons or deaf patrons. We haven't had these people come before. It's the same thing when you go into, when deaf people walk into anywhere, and people see sign language and really just kind of shut down. And it doesn't always have to be that complicated. Deaf people are very deft at navigating their own space and gesturing or writing something down. They will meet you halfway. So I encourage prioritization of, always having someone who is on staff who has that language and culture growing up. It doesn't always have to be an interpreter, but if they have at least some awareness of deaf language and culture, then they can meet someone knowing kind of how to approach everything that they need, is being ready with whatever resources are available to hand off to this patron. So even if they don't, they're not fluent, they're not bilingual, bicultural, you still have the training and the awareness there. If you do have the interpreter, you can, or if you don't have an interpreter, you can use ASL as a bridge to other. You can use other resources as a bridge or as a connection to break down those language barriers until you can get an interpreter there. But really, it's, again, ask the deaf person, what is your language? What is your culture? What is your linguistic preference? Do your research first, or really ask that person first, instead of just making assumptions of what they might need. If you ask them, they will be able to lead you and guide you in what is best accommodation for them. Thank you.
I think that's beautiful things that all of you said. I think that there can be a lot of fear in hearing about what people need to experience your space or your event, or fear in hearing their feedback about it. And as with anything public facing or service industry related, you are never going to hit everything that you need with everyone. And that can be okay. You can miss the mark and you can not meet people's expectations. But as long as you're listening and you are trying to do better next time, it's always better to have done something than to have done nothing. So I think fear keeps a lot of us back from beginning somewhere with access. And with that, I want to go into, I think this will be our final question, but I think it was a really good one that we got. So it begins, since there are varying levels of expertise, experience, and skills, how do we ensure that we're identifying and hiring the best access professionals for specific events? For example, finding someone who can interpret music well or theater, could be finding an audio describer. Is it just a matter of consistently asking for feedback after our events from our audience? Or is there another way? So I guess basically, how do we find people like our three panelists?
Chuck, why don't you go first? Because you probably had experience.
So I think this is a really interesting question. It's also important. I want to make sure that I address what Andy just said, which is it is exceedingly important to start somewhere. It is also very easy to get excited that you want to provide all those services immediately. And if you're not paying attention to the specifics of those, you might be getting a little bit ahead of your boots. I'm not even sure if that's the phrase. I'm sorry. But too big for your boots. Sorry. But it is so important when you're speaking to somebody about providing access that, one, the engagement and the way that you're having the conversation about the possibilities in the future is starting on the same ground. So you want to make sure that you're using the same vocabulary. If there are examples of like a gallery using not acronyms basically, and expecting that everybody has the same understanding of that vocabulary. So when you have these conversations and you're speaking to somebody about the possibility of working with you, that you start with a ground rule or baseline of the same vocabulary. That way, when you work together on your projects, you have a little bit better understanding. But it's also important to kind of reach out to other organizations and see who they've worked with. The feedback doesn't just come from us. I think it's really important to be able to reach out to people that I've worked for. And, for example, Andy could reach out to somebody and reference my work because I have had these opportunities. It's harder for people who haven't had opportunities to prove themselves. So giving people an opportunity is really wonderful, but also making sure that you're contacting their references to make sure that their style of work and their approach to the concept is similar to what you want. And making sure that the intent is there and that you're clear and consistent with your communication style with the people that you're trying to provide these services for. Did I answer that question? I feel like I got off track. Sorry.
I'll go. It's been my experience that
I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. Susan Elizabeth going?
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Beth.
Okay. My experience that the people that are in audience services are always very good at this, and I'm gonna grossly generalize here because that's what I do. But I think if somebody works in audience services at a cultural arts organization, one, they could be in retail and make a lot more money, but they are at they're at a cultural arts organization because they enjoy having all sorts of people and doing all sorts of things and dealing with different personalities and stuff. That's theater, and that's museums, and that's art, and that's dance, so I think they have, to me, they've always been the best at this. You're just another audience member. I mean, I feel that way with these people that have had some background in audience services. So that's just that's a generalization, but I think that's been my experience that they're cool with it. And they do ask you, what do you need? Because I think you would ask any person that walked in, if they looked a little lost, can I help you with something? That's what audience service people do.
Right. I think for a simple answer from me is how to find the best qualified people. Contact the person who has the experience. So if you're trying to figure out who might have that, I know it's simple, but it's like ask for feedback from your from the director, from a contact you might have, but then check if they actually have that experience. What have they dealt with? And if you're coming up short, sit down with a consultant and ask them, can you tell me about services that have gone well here? What could we do better? Just to kind of brainstorm what the vision is. You might get some great resources from that. You can contact me anytime. I'd be happy to sit down with you and consult and advise in that respect. Ultimately, it will be your decision what you go ahead with, but that's one idea. I am deaf, so I will be experiencing the access. I have experience coordinating this access. So if you have a person who already embodies that disability, who might have some experience with this kind of thing, you can maybe draw them in and ask them if they have any direct contact with people they might want to work with.
Yeah, I completely agree, Susan Elizabeth. It's really important, especially I think that there's a part of the work that we do that is kind of hard to navigate, because we want to make sure that we're not gatekeeping any of the access work that we have. We want to make sure that if you admire an organization or the programming that they're doing, don't feel bad about contacting them and say, hey, I really like what you're doing. Can you give me some advice? As a young person, I feel like people are a lot nicer to me about that. I kind of pull the still learning card, and everyone is very, very welcoming and willing to speak to me. But I think it's one of those things where we can't, for example, like you can't pit yourself against other organizations in terms of access. Make sure that you're reaching out to people that you admire and that you are interested in working with. Or if you have questions or don't have a lot of experience, it's not out of the ordinary to reach out to somebody else in your same position at another organization. So I think everybody in the accessibility world wants to make this work, wants to make content more available. Just like the same with Susan Elizabeth, if you want to reach out to me, you're more than welcome. I might not be able to answer your question, but I might be able to help you find someone who could. That whole thing will work for most people in the access world. And just asking questions, having these hard conversations it's so important. And it's really, really important you feel comfortable reaching out to people you admire and work that you've seen that you want to continue doing.
And if I can add one more thing, same with me. I love hearing, it's fun to hear from people who want to do this. So I'm also open to any questions I might be able to answer via emails, my favorite contact So just, yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, those were lovely answers. And I know we are at time now. We have just gotten even more questions. So we have more questions that I will send along to our panelists. And hopefully I'll be able to include that with some of our post-program materials that we send out to all of our guests afterwards. So we'll be including the contact information for our panelists. We will include some examples of their work, their websites, the places that they are involved with. We'll also be including a survey about this event and your experience with this event. It's always helpful if you can fill that out for us so that we can improve our events and make them more tailored to what you would like to see and hear. I once again want to thank our panelists tremendously for being here. I want to thank IACA for the funding that they've given us. I want to thank the CCAC for being a tremendous parent organization. Some of the questions that we received that we didn't get to have been discussed in previous webinars with the CCAC and ICANN. And you can go to our website and those webinars are available to watch. So we do have that available if you are looking for specifically information about grants. I saw some questions about that. But thank you all again for being here. And that is all we have for today. I hope we'll have you back in an event soon.
White text on black background. Ask About Access, presented by Illinois Cultural Accessibility Network. For workshop resources and more information, visit chicagoculturalaccess.org. Presenting speakers: Moderator Andy Wilson, ICANN and CCAC Steering Committee; Beth Finke, author, teacher, and journalist; Chuck Grumman, accessibility consultant; Susan Elizabeth Rangel, ASL director and teacher. Workshop Accessibility: real-time captioning and ASL interpretation provided by Alternative Communication Services. Video editing, captioning, and audio description by BridgetMelton.com.